Growing up, we were all told similar yet also different stories and myths. For example, many countries and cultures have their own version of the cryptid you might call Bigfoot, from the Yeti of the Himalayas to the Yowie of Australia to the Capre of the Philippines in Southeast Asia. A quick Google search reveals that they all look rather similar, and whatever differences you may find are usually due to the topography and cultural differences, among other things. This is a common cultural phenomena for stories and myths to be retold, sometimes with small, sometimes big differences. In the case of the New Testament Gospels, a common subject in my videos, the same phenomenon can be seen, as I have shown many times in my other videos. There are many reasons as to why the Gospel writers may have different versions of what we might presume to be the same story. Some have suggested that it's because they are writing from different perspectives. An example is the insistence of many on the tradition that the author of the Gospel of John truly was John, the son of Zebedee, the fisherman, and thus would be a reliable eyewitness to the events the Gospel narrates. But as I have discussed previously, church traditions are not always reliable explanations. Even if John the fisherman was in fact the author of the Gospel of John, he would have still been absent in many of the scenes he narrates, such as the trial of Jesus before Pilate, or the conversation between Jesus and Nicodemus, or the conversations of the Pharisees with one another. The same can be said for the traditionally ascribed authors of the four Gospels, Mark, Matthew, and Luke. Moreover, if the Gospel writers were in fact like four witnesses in court telling the same story, as many have insisted, why do Matthew and Luke have a huge portion of their Gospels that are nearly word for word with one another, and with Mark? Was each Gospel truly meant to be read in light of the others? This is probably what most of us were used to, reading a story from one of the four Gospels and assuming they're always telling the same exact story with the same message. But a careful reading shows us that the Gospel writers each tried to make their own work unique, to the point of changing their stories to fit their own themes and messages different from the other Gospels. To more easily explain this, let's take a look at a story that occurs in all four Gospels, the story of the anointing at Bethany, though that title might not be so accurate, and you'll see why in a bit. The story of the anointing at Bethany is summarized as this. Jesus is in a house with some people, then a woman comes and anoints him. The other men in the house become critical, Jesus calls them out and defends the woman. Now that's a very general and unspecific recounting of the story. Well, that's because I wanted to tell it in a way that doesn't contradict any of the Gospels. The story of the anointing at Bethany can be found in Mark 14, Matthew 26, Luke chapter 7, yes, I'll explain that one, and John chapter 12. Mark and Matthew's accounts are very similar and happen at the same time in the narrative, right before Judas' betrayal and the Last Supper. In the Gospel of John, it happens 6 days before the Passover, before Jesus even enters Jerusalem. As for the Gospel of Luke, well, the story you might call the story of the sinful woman found in chapter 7 is likely the same story found in Mark and Matthew, but instead of happening in Bethany, in Judea, it happens all the way back in Galilee, in the house of a Pharisee named Simon. Curiously, Simon is also the name of the owner of the house Jesus dines in the story of Mark and Matthew. It's also worth noting that Mark, Matthew, and Luke have very similar Passion Week narratives, with one key difference being, you guessed it, the anointing story being missing in Luke. Why? Because it already happened back in Galilee. In John, the story happens in the house of Lazarus. Here's a table I made of some of the other differences in the narratives. They not only show the, differences, but also show why the story of the sinful woman in Luke is meant to be the same as the anointing story at Bethany found in Mark and Matthew. Now, I've already mentioned the setting being different, but there's a few more key differences I want to highlight, among other things. In Mark and Matthew, the woman is simply an unnamed woman with no description. In Luke, she too is unnamed, yet we are told she's a sinful woman of some sorts. People today have interpreted this to mean she's a prostitute, but that's not explicit in the text. The Greek word used for sinner also doesn't seem to mean prostitute outright as well. In the Gospel of John, the woman is Mary, the sister of Lazarus. In Mark and Matthew, Jesus' head gets anointed. In Luke and John, it's Jesus' feet. The people who criticize the act are also different, depending on which Gospel. In Mark, they are unspecified. In Matthew, it's the disciples. In Luke, it's just the Pharisees Jesus dines with. In the Gospel of John, it's just Judas who speaks up. These are not outright groundbreaking contradictions, but it's undeniable that these stories are providing different versions of the same story. Early on in the 19th century, critical scholars from Europe acknowledged that the Gospels could not be seen as eyewitness accounts of the life of Jesus, seeing the numerous discrepancies and even contradictions within them. This led to a search for the original Greek, not Latin, manuscripts of the Gospels. But scholars quickly realized that the originals were likely lost to time or the elements, and so the next best thing is to look for the earliest manuscripts. The authorship of the Gospels were also put into question, especially the Gospel of John. Did the Apostle John, son of Zebedee, the fisherman, really author this text? If so, then this would classify as a first-hand account of the life of Jesus. Anyone who's read the Gospel of John, and the other Gospels for that matter, might have noticed that John's Gospel is rather different compared to the other three, which are very similar. These other three Gospels, Mark, Matthew, and Luke, are called the Synoptic Gospels as they can be read side by side due to their similarities. A quick comparison of their stories revealed that they are not only similar, but many times are word for word, even in Greek. How do you have independent authors writing the exact same things word for word? They aren't always word for word though. Sometimes Mark and Matthew, for instance, have a similar story that's almost word for word, yet have a few differences. For instance, in Mark, Jesus asked the 12, "Who do the people say he is?" in the first person. In Matthew, the account is almost word for word, save for the part where Jesus asks his disciples. Here, he asks them, "Who do the people say the Son of Man is?" In the anointing at Bethany story I mentioned a while ago, I briefly mentioned that Matthew says the disciples critiqued the woman, while in Mark, it simply says those who were with him. These are very small, even insignificant differences, but they show us a pattern that can help us understand the nature and relationship of the synoptics to one another. It is well understood by modern historians that the synoptics are so similar because they copied one another. More specifically, Matthew and Luke copied Mark. Matthew and Luke also have material in them that cannot be found in Mark, so either Luke copied Matthew or, this is what plenty of historians believe, Matthew and Luke had another source separate from Mark. But sadly, we do not have a written copy of this source. There are many sayings and stories found in Matthew and Luke only, such as the Beatitudes, the Lord's Prayer, the Golden Rule, the Parable of the Talents, and more. This source is commonly called Q, short for quella, which means source. The idea that Matthew and Luke copied Mark and used Q is called the two-source hypothesis, but it's not the only hypothesis. Another is the fairer hypothesis, where Matthew and Luke copied Mark, but Luke also used Matthew as a source. There's also the three-source hypothesis, which seems to be a hybrid of the aforementioned two-source and fairer hypothesis, where Luke used Mark, Matthew, Q, and that Q could have possibly been an Aramaic source for Mark. In all of these, Mark's gospel takes priority. But why? Well, if you watch my other videos, I say that Mark is first or the earliest among the four because it's more primitive. It lacks a birth narrative, unlike Matthew or Luke. It has a more simplistic yet somehow confusing resurrection story, and it seemed to be about the suffering in the context of the First Jewish-Roman War, which happened in 70 CE, as well as the eschatological expectations at that time. Matthew and Luke, if they copied Mark, would be writing way later, once Mark had been in circulation. And of course, these people, who were living way later on and had different views from Mark, would change things as they see fit. Think about it, if Mark copied Matthew, why would Mark remove the birth narrative? In my Gospel of Matthew video, I highlighted a lot of corrections Matthew makes to Mark. This doesn't mean Mark was objectively wrong, it's just that Matthew, I guess, updated Mark in his Gospel. Some of these small changes include what I've mentioned earlier, and sometimes it's just simple grammatical corrections. Think of these small changes as corrections or revisions. As for the Gospel of John, well, it's pretty different, start to finish. It does have a few stories which can be found in the Synoptics, such as the anointing at Bethany, the feeding of the 5,000, and the walking on water. The fact that these stories appear in all four Gospels likely mean that these stories were very popular and widespread. And hey, why wouldn't they be? A story about Jesus feeding thousands of poor people would be everyone's favorite story. So hopefully I did a not so terrible job of explaining the synoptic problem, and why is it that there's different versions of what we might presume to be the same stories. As for why Matthew or Luke have a different version of a story from Mark or Q, well, answer me this. Why would they write their own gospel in the first place? The answer is probably the same. They have their own views, either about Jesus, the Christian message, or they have their own points they want to get across. According to David Strauss, a German theologian in the 19th century, the Gospels contain stories that did not happen but conveyed certain truths in them, specifically religious truths. In John and Mark, Jesus appears to walk on water, then gets into the boat. In Matthew's change to Mark, Jesus has a conversation with Peter, and Peter even steps off the boat to try to walk with Jesus. The boat is meant to be the church. The disciples are, well, the Christians. Jesus is Jesus. The storm is the persecution that rocks the boat, and Peter is you, or I guess anyone who wants to be like Jesus. Peter tries to be like Jesus, but his faith causes him to stumble, which is a recurring lesson for Christians, to have faith amidst the storm. Matthew adds a few more things to the story from Mark, either to give a whole new meaning to the story or to convey this idea better than Mark did. The story of the walking on water, therefore, is not a story about something that happened, but about something that happens, something relevant beyond its time. Whether or not this affects your belief in the historicity of the story is up to you. Another example I want to tackle is the baptism story, and here we have a bit of a trend if you read each narrative chronologically. That is to say, if you read Mark, then Matthew, then Luke, then John at last. In Mark, Jesus comes out of Galilee, gets baptized, then John the Baptist himself sees the heavens open, and the Spirit descending on Jesus, then the voice from heaven. In the Gospel of Matthew, John hesitates to baptize Jesus, believing he's greater than him. John the Baptist outright refuses to baptize Jesus without his insistence. In the Gospel of John, the baptism is reduced to a recollection by John the Baptist as a testimony of Jesus' true nature. These subtle changes Matthew makes to Mark's baptism story are because Matthew doesn't want for it to come across as if Jesus was somehow spiritually inferior to John since John baptized him. If one were to read Mark's account only, especially if you lived in the time of the early church, that's how it would come across. The one baptizing you is usually spiritually superior to you. Think of Paul, Peter, or any of the apostles baptizing new converts. It's a necessary change Matthew makes so as to not confuse his readers or his church. It doesn't mean Matthew thinks Mark's wrong, it's just another revision. And I think that's pretty much all I wanted to tackle. There are way more stories in the Synoptics that are either word for word in Greek or very similar in structure. If you want to learn more, I highly recommend reading Professor Mark Goodacre's The Synoptic Problem, A Way Through the Maze. It's available for free on the Internet Archive.